All right. We are on part 4 of chapter 5 of unit 7, the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. We have moved to the third commandment. Remember to keep holy the Lord's Day. When we look at this section, we are talking about questions 12 and 13, if I remember correctly. If I don't, sorry, not sorry, really. Like, you can follow the directions and find them when I read the questions. But the third commandment is an important one that I think we sometimes kind of push off to the side, but it's important. And we'll talk about why it's important in earnest tomorrow. But, we'll talk about it now too. So what is the importance of this section, pages 146 to 149 in your textbook? It really just kind of lays out the tradition, the historical tradition behind this particular, the importance of the Sabbath and the Lord's Day and how they're different yet the same. Okay. So the summary for this section: originally God gave the Sabbath to the chosen people. Who are the chosen people? The Jewish people, right? As a day to rest from work and to worship Him with sacrifices. Christ restored the original emphasis on the Sabbath by teaching that the Sabbath was made for man, right? Not man for the Sabbath. Christian worship moved from the Sabbath to, Christian worship was always kind of originally a 2-day affair, right? We know that Jewish worship always on Saturday, the Sabbath. Early Christians, and we talked about this, so this is just kind of review. For early Christians, it was a 2-day affair. Saturday night synagogue, right? Kind of what we would recognize today as the liturgy of the word, readings, etc. And then Sunday worship, liturgy of the Eucharist. Okay. Now, Christian worship eventually moved from Sabbath and Lord's Day worship to the Lord's Day exclusively. That was kind of, in some sense, forced on them by the reaction of their Jewish brothers, but also kind of happened kind of naturally as well. Okay, so let's take a look then at questions. Trying to do the math in my head here. 12 and 13, I think. Yeah, I think I said 12 and 13. What is the Sabbath, and why do Christians worship God on Sunday and not the Sabbath? So, very simply, what is the Sabbath? God gave the Sabbath to His chosen people as a day of rest from work and to worship Him with sacrifices. So, when we talk about the Lord's Day, when we talk about the Sabbath, and we kind of use those interchangeably, they mean the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing, right? So what is the Sabbath? Sabbath is the seventh day, right? If we go back to the story of Genesis, we see the seventh day was the day of rest. Did God need to rest? Of course not. Why does Genesis show to us God resting, showing the importance for us humans of rest and relaxation, but also to worship, right? So God doesn't need to rest, right? So why did He rest on the Sabbath? Some kind of answers to that question, because there's more than one. Underline the goodness of creation. God made it and it was good, right? One of the things, God saw that it was good, right? To show man how important it is to contemplate God and His creation. To show us the necessity of enjoying life, right? To foreshadow heaven, the Sabbath that lasts for eternity, right? To show that work is not all that life is about, right? Allergies. As human beings, we are not slaves to work, and we shouldn't make other people slaves to work either, right? So when we look at the Sabbath, God instituted laws for the priesthood, the construction of the temple, principal feasts, practice of worship, and above all, celebration of the Sabbath. We see that happening in the books of Exodus, right? Leviticus, Deuteronomy. All that stuff focuses us in on the importance of the Sabbath in worship and rest, right? So you're probably saying to yourselves, okay, this is great. You give this, terrible history. What does the Sabbath have to do with Sunday worship, the Lord's Day? And the answer is fairly straightforward. Um, when we look at Christian history, um, the church, and by the church I mean the Christian church, has always celebrated the Eucharist on Sundays. So Sundays in the Christian faith have always been the Lord's Day, right? The reception of the Eucharist. And those celebrations of the Eucharist took place on Sunday. Why? What happens on Sunday? Easter, right? Every Sunday Mass is a representation, making present for us Easter Sunday. We talked about this when we talked about communion, right? So how then does that kind of character of Sabbath move to Sundays? Well, we have to look post-resurrection, obviously, and the practice of the early church. First Christians were Jews, right? Saw themselves as devout Jews who also worshiped this guy, Jesus, as not just guy, but God, right? The Messiah. And eventually they got kicked out, right? That's the long and the short answer. About 70 AD or so. Before then, about 40 AD, Christianity is new. In the next decade or two, the Jewish people eventually got fed up with the bad attention being brought to them, and kicked the Christians out, right? And that's the long and the short of it. Pretty soon, about 78-ish, 80 AD, the Jewish people themselves were kicked out of the temple, and the Romans razed the temple, and they weren't allowed to worship either. But first, the Christians were kicked out. And since they could no longer celebrate on Saturdays, they moved their worship to Sundays. And since the main focus of their celebration is and always has been the Eucharist, Sunday, the Lord's Day, became the day of worship. Okay? So why do Christians worship God on Sunday and not Sabbath? The short answer is Christian worship moved from the Sabbath and the Lord's Day to the Lord's Day exclusively, for a number of reasons, not least of which is because they were kicked out of the synagogues in the middle parts of the first century. Okay? We will continue our story of the importance of celebrating the Lord's Day on Monday. Have a good weekend. Love you guys. Miss you guys terribly. I can't tell you enough times how much I miss you guys and love you guys. But this is yet another time, and I will see you guys on Monday. Have a good weekend.